Um, Welcome to the first virtual Orcas Island Garden Club program. My name is Nita Couchman and I am your president since last August, and I suppose this is my inaugural address. Not to compare to what is going on in the rest of the nation today, but welcome to the Garden Club program. This has been a challenging year for everybody, and the Garden Club included. We're hoping for brighter days ahead, and our board is continuing to plan programs that we hope will be of interest and educational and fun for you. We're working on more monthly virtual programs until we can start meeting in person again. We have board members who are working on plans for a safe garden tour this June. Since we were not able to meet last June, we're trying to work with the conditions that we have now so we can have a safe garden tour for us all this summer. We're also all beginning to look forward to planning our gardens for the coming season. If you're a Garden Club member, you should have received this month's newsletter in your mailbox this morning. Check out the great articles on seed catalogs and seeds as you start dreaming about what you're going to be planting this spring. Also, I want to remind you to save the date. February 17th is going to be our next virtual online meeting. It's going to be a virtual tea party with a tea making demonstration, a baking demonstration, and a greenery arrangement demonstration. It should be quite fun. So we're inviting you all to bring your cup of tea or coffee and join us for a little tea party online. I also want to remind you that it's not too late to renew your membership in the Garden Club or to make a donation. We've made it easier for you to do that by adding PayPal and an online membership form to our website. Also, we have recently become a 501c3 nonprofit organization, so your donations are now tax deductible. So if that's something that is of concern for you, you may now do that. Today's program is jointly sponsored by the Garden Club and the Orcas Library. So I want to thank the library for their helping us in sponsoring this program today. I thank you all for coming, and I know that this is going to be a great program. So I will turn the mic over to Lena Symes, our program person, and we'll get on with our program. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're delighted to have all of you here and to have Tor presenting for us this morning. I just want to acknowledge that Evangelina Sullivan was the person who reached out to him a year ago when he first agreed. So I'm grateful to her for doing that. A few things to do to make the presentation go as effectively as possible to help so that you have the best reception for what I've short preview know are wonderful slides that Tor would like to be able to continue to show through the time that's here. But so if you would mute your mics, close your videos so that put your presentations in speaker view. And then when you have questions, if you would put them into chat and they will go to the library. And our wonderful librarians are going to keep track of them for us. And then we'll try and group them and ask Tor at the end some of the questions, depending on time we have remaining. With that, I would very much like to welcome Tor Hansen. Tor is an author and biologist. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, a Schweizer Environmental Fellow, and winner of the John Burroughs Medal. His books include Buzz, The Triumph of Seeds, Feathers and the Impenetrable Forest, as well as the illustrated children's favorite, Bartholomew Quill. Tor's work has been translated into more than 10 languages and earned many accolades, including the Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science and 3 Pacific Northwest Book Awards. He co-hosted the PBS Nature series American Spring Live and has been a guest on programs ranging from Fresh Air to Science Friday, on print and Book Lust with Nancy Pearl. Hansen lives with his wife and son on an island in the Pacific Northwest. Thank you so much for joining us, Tor. We will mute, we will turn off our videos, and we will watch your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lena, very much, and Nita and Holly at the library, everyone for inviting me and arranging and supporting this presentation this morning. I was telling the folks earlier, for those of you who just tuned in, that you're getting a front seat presentation this morning. This is the front seat version of my office here at the parking lot behind the San Juan Island Library, which is the best place on the island for doing Zoom presentations, because the internet, hopefully, and bear with me, but the internet should be stable enough for us to even do some slides here this morning. So I'm really happy to be here. I, of course, wish that we could all be in the same room together, but I know that time will come again. And in the meanwhile, we can be thankful to our technology for allowing this substitute. I'm going to later on in a few minutes share my screen with you so that we can go through some slides together. I will probably also then make a few blunders as that happens, because I'm quite a lot handier with a pair of binoculars or a hand lens than I am with technology, but I think we'll get through it together. I plan on talking today for between 30 and 40 minutes, and then leaving the rest of our time together for your questions. So I do encourage you to submit questions to the chat, and we'll get to those towards the end. I want to add this morning that it is a particular pleasure to connect with the Orcas Island Garden Club, because my family has a long history, deep roots in Orcas Island gardening. My mother tended her vegetables and flower garden on the Doe Bay side of the island, and my great-grandfather and his wife had an extensive kitchen garden all the way on the other side of the island at Deer Harbor at Arcady Farm, where they lived. So I was recently going through some old family correspondence from the 1940s and 50s, and canning the vegetables and fruits from the garden was, I think, the most common topic of discussion in those letters. Very big into gardening at that time. So it's a pleasure to be with you. Now, our topic this morning of discussion is common garden wonders, and we will be drawing upon work that I've done and writing that I've done on seeds and on bees. Now, it's true that I have also written a book about feathers, and there is an argument to be made that birds are also pretty common in a garden setting. But if we were to include them, we would be dangerously close to a lecture on the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees. And we don't want to give a lecture on a 1960s pop song. So I think it's just as well that we focus on the insects and the seeds here this morning. But if you do have questions when we get to that point about other topics, feel free. I'm happy to answer any of your questions that might come up this morning. As a biologist and as an author, it's no surprise that I spend a lot of my time focusing on plants and on animals and insects and so forth. But I also spend a lot of energy thinking about people, because it really is my goal and my hope for this work that I not only learn about the natural world, but that I can help people to reconnect with the natural world. And to that end, I am particularly fascinated by natural objects that transcend the imaginary, but nonetheless very significant boundary that we erect between the human world and the natural world. Wilderness areas and national parks are marvelous places, but they're often remote from where we live, and places we visit only occasionally, and for many people, places that are never visited at all. Yet in our daily lives, we are surrounded by natural objects, even in our own homes, and certainly anytime we step outdoors, and perhaps nowhere more intimately than in the garden with our hands in the soil. So these things that
Tor, I'm so sorry we accidentally muted you. Can you start your microphone again?
how's that? Are we back on?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for alerting me. So when we encounter these natural wonders, whether they're bees or seeds or even more common things in our homes and in our backyards, and when we're gardening with our hands in the soil, we are connecting to stories that really remind us of biology and of evolution, of nature, and our deep connections and relationships to it. And what I want to do this morning then is to tell you several of those stories that have to do with seeds and bees and these marvelous things that I've spent so much time studying. So at this point, I'm going to attempt this Zoom miracle of sharing my screen with you, and we will see how we do. And we should be right there. All right, now if I go here, I should be able to play that. Okay, now technology check here. Are you guys seeing a slide that says Common Garden Wonders, and are you hearing my voice at roughly the same time?
Yes, that's perfect, Tor. It's working great.
Okay, fabulous, fabulous, good. So I want to start off with a story about seeds and tell you that when I first started working on seeds and working on the seed book, my wife, Eliza, made an interesting observation. I had previously written a book about mountain gorillas, and then I had written a book about feathers, and I was starting this project on seeds, and she looked at me and she said, you know, your topics keep getting smaller, which was an excellent point. It made me think maybe I should be working on dust motes after seeds, but nonetheless, I have learned that the size of an object has no bearing whatsoever upon its importance or upon the remarkable stories that it has to tell us. So if we just consider one of the most basic characteristics of a seed, which I like to think of as endurance, the ability to lie dormant in the soil for months, for years, even for decades before sprouting. Now, we take it for granted that a packet of seeds can be stored through the winter and then planted again in the spring, or that staple grains like wheat and corn and rice can sit around for long periods in silos, warehouses, and even in our pantries and remain fresh. Our farming and food systems depend upon dormancy, but biologically, this trait remains quite mysterious. How does a baby plant enter what amounts to a state of suspended animation and then spring to life again when the time is right? Experts still aren't sure, but they know it has something to do with a substance called bioglass. We know that each cell within a truly dormant seed becomes desiccated. They dry out until the cells have lost 85, 90, even 95% of their water. And what's left inside those cells, the nucleus and the various organelles and so forth that keep a cell running, they become encased in this sugar-like glass substance that somehow preserves not only form and function, but also a memory of arrangement. so that upon germination, when the cells are once again flooded with water, things not only start working again, they resume the same positions and relationships to one another that they had to begin with. And they start working as if no time had passed at all. Now, we can't really do that with animal cells, so don't try this at home. But plants have figured out this program, and it works very well indeed for seeds. And we don't know quite how it works, but that hasn't stopped scientists from starting to use that seed technology, if you will, that trick of desiccation in other formats. For example, the world's first dry vaccines that do not need to be refrigerated. And we've all been thinking a lot about vaccines lately, and we know that the vaccines for the coronavirus, some of them at least, need not only to be refrigerated, but frozen at minus 80 degrees. Yet for certain vaccines now, by copying seed innovations, scientists have developed vaccines that can be stored for months at room temperature. Suspending live measles vaccine in something called myo-inositol will let it last upon the shelf, even in places that are far too remote for refrigeration. It's a game changer in the world of vaccinations. And where did they get that myo-inositol in the first place? That's something that is found within the seeds of legumes, within nuts, and within grains of rice, a natural product. So like seeds then that inspired those vaccines, they can remain viable, desiccated, ready to travel for months and months on end. But of course, as all of you who are gardeners know, some seeds can last a lot longer than a few months, which invites an obvious seed question, and that is, how long can a dormant seed survive? Now, the answer to that question is an incredible story in its own right. And it begins at a place called Masada. And in case you missed the miniseries, this was back in the 1980s when Peter O'Toole starred in the Masada miniseries. In case you missed that, Masada is an ancient fortress that sits atop a rocky crag on the shores of the Dead Sea. It was the site of a famous siege in the waning days of the Great Revolt, when a band of Jewish rebels held out against a full Roman legion for months on end. And when the Romans finally breached those high walls, they found that the rebels had committed mass suicide rather than surrender to the Romans. So this is a very important cultural site in modern day Israel. And as such, it has been thoroughly excavated and studied by archaeologists. The studies began in the 1960s. Now, during the course of the digs there, they have found weapons, they have found coins, they have found storehouses still full of food, including a trove of dates that were so well preserved by that dry desert air that bits of date flesh were still clinging to the pits. A fantastic find, because these were not just any old dates, but they were Judean dates, which is a variety of dates that was famous throughout the ancient world. It's mentioned in the Bible. It was reported to be the favorite date of the Emperor Augustus. And they were the cash crop of King Herod's kingdom. Yet they had disappeared. The variety had gone extinct. Not long after the fall of Judea, people stopped growing Judean dates, and they were always looked upon as something of a mystery. What were those dates like in all this time? So this was a very exciting find to have these Judean dates in good shape, and being good archaeologists, they wrote numbers on all of these little date seeds and stuffed them into a drawer in a museum in Tel Aviv. But a few years ago, some botanists got a hold of a few of these and they planted them. And lo and behold, if one of those date pits didn't sprout and grow into a perfectly healthy Judean date palm after 2,000 years buried in the rubble at Masada. A phenomenal story. They named him Methuselah, gave him his own enclosed little compound at a kibbutz in southern Israel. And it is a he, by the way, because the sexes are upon different plants in the date palm. And ever since this thing sprouted, the researchers, the botanists, have been madly trying to get another date pit to sprout so that they could have a female and fully resurrect this ancient biblical fruit. And I'm happy to say that just within the last 6 months, they finally published a paper about this. They were successful. They started looking not only at Masada, but at other archaeological sites throughout the ancient world, and they gathered up all of the date pits they could find and planted a variety of them. They got a female finally to sprout, and just this past year, for the first time in 2 millennia, they harvested the Judean date once again. And one of the scientists in Israel said, luckily, they were delicious, because they would have felt extremely foolish spending a decade on this project if the dates had tasted crummy. But no, they are very tasty and wonderful date with a lot of medicinal uses from the ancient world as well. So everyone is thrilled to have these things back. It's a marvelous symbol of endurance and mystery and the power contained within a seed. And Methuselah is hardly the only amazing seed out there. The director of our national seed bank here in the States, which is in Fort Collins, Colorado, a marvelous place, her name is Chris Walters, and she told me something truly remarkable about dormant seeds. She knows more about them than pretty much anyone, because she is taking care of millions, close to 1 billion dormant seeds in our national seed bank. So she is truly a world expert. And she told me this, and I will quote it. She said, if we know of living things that aren't metabolizing, then maybe we need to change our definition of what it means to be alive. Because what she has learned by studying these dormant seeds is that for many of them, the truly dormant seeds, they have no measurable metabolic activity. You put one of these seeds into a device that measures the metabolism going on, and it comes up empty every time. Nothing is happening within them, yet they remain alive. And that is truly remarkable. A seed, something as common as a seed, challenging our very definition of what it means to be living. So I could rattle off all sorts of other seed stories, but I love that one about good old Methuselah and now the additional Judean dates that they've brought back to life. And I'll sum up on seeds by quoting one of my favorite seed quotes, which comes to us from George Bernard Shaw, who wrote in 1918, "Think of the fierce energy concentrated in an acorn. You bury it in the ground and it explodes into a giant oak. Bury a sheep and nothing happens but decay." Now, bees are another essential garden wonder, and they have been on my mind too for a long time, in part because of a story that I heard years ago, and one that I think says so much about the human relationship to nature. In the mid-1990s, I worked on a mountain gorilla project in a place called Bwindi Impenetrable Forest in southwestern Uganda. And since that time, I have learned that many people will actually get mad at me if I don't include at least one picture of a baby gorilla in every slide program that I give. So here is this morning's baby gorilla. And the job there involved a lot of tracking gorillas through the rainforest, and we were often set upon by hordes of tiny little black flies. At least I thought they were flies. For weeks, really, until I bothered to look closely, and I realized that these things were actually tiny bees. Oh, I'm having a technical glitch. Let's see if I can get through it. Wouldn't you know it, folks? You put a baby gorilla, they're always showstoppers, and they actually have stolen the show once again. And I seem to be all locked out. There we go. Okay, good. Now let's see if I can get back to okay. Sorry, folks. All right, are we back? Let's see. Well, anyway, you can see a couple of bees on there. These are stingless bees, these marvelous little stingless bees. And I realized that these things were bees, and I was absolutely fascinated. And not long after that, a graduate student from Makerere University in Kampala named Vincent came down to study stingless bees for his master's thesis. And he, after a week or so, was absolutely tearing his hair out. He could sort of see his whole thesis fizzling out and right in front of his eyes because he couldn't find any nests of these stingless bees. There were plenty of bees around, but he could never find a place where they were nesting, and his whole research project relied upon finding bees' nests. So how on earth was he going to do it? Well, the folks there that I worked with, the trackers and the local people, suggested that he go and visit with some Batois, these people who until quite recently had called that forest home and knew more about its natural history than virtually anyone. And so Vincent did. He went over to the Batois community and he hired a guide for a day. And the guide and Vincent walked into the forest, and he said the fellow led him straight to a beautiful little clearing where they sat down by a patch of flowers and they started to watch. And sure enough, after a short period of time, a stingless bee arrived on one of the flowers, and it fossicked around there for a while, getting some nectar and pollen and so forth, and then disappeared off in the forest. And they waited. A little while later, another bee, same story. A little while later, another bee, same story. He did it over and over again. And Vincent said he was just starting to think, what am I paying this guy for? They've been sitting in this field staring at bees on flowers for an hour. And then finally the man said, we go. He stood up and he walked back into the forest, walking briskly, parting the leaves and branches and everything for a certain period of time. And then he looked around and he saw a stump and he said, there you go. And there was the nest of the bees. They were coming in and out of this rotten stump. So the man was able to track bees through a rainforest, which for me stands really at the pinnacle of natural history. How could this be possible? I will never in all of my studies reach such a state of familiarity with the natural world. But for this man, it was obvious, because he knew enough about natural history. His relationship to that forest was so intuitive that he knew what kind of bees were out there. He knew what kind of flowers they liked, so he knew where to sit and wait for the bees. He watched them as they flew off, so he knew what direction the nest was in, and he was in his mind measuring the length of time that it took them to make a round trip. And since everybody knows how fast a stingless bee flies, he was able then to estimate the distance. And because he knew that species of stingless bee, there were 9 or 10 in the forest, but he knew that one nested in rotten logs and stumps, all he had to do was go in that direction for the right amount of time and look for a stump, and he would find his bees. And in fact, that's exactly what he did. And so tracking bees in the jungle is something that reminds me, and I think it should remind all of us, that it really is our own history in terms of connecting with nature. There is a lot more bee tracking in our collective history as a species than there is texting or conducting Zoom meetings, for that matter. So when we learn about natural history, when we learn about bees and seeds and so forth, it's not just an act of exploration. It really is, in some ways, an act of remembrance. And remembering bees is particularly important these days because we've all seen the headlines about colony collapse disorder, honeybee colonies collapsing in mass, also widespread declines in many other kinds of bees, from our lovely bumblebees to all sorts of wild species. But in reading those stories, I have noticed a certain mushiness, shall we say, in the subject matter. And it reminds me that what do people really know about bees? What do we really know about bees in the 21st century? We're certainly not tracking them through jungles very often any longer. It's true now that even experts often stumble over the details of bee biology. I was once listening to the radio in my car while driving along when I heard a noted historian of science being interviewed. And he said that when the settlers arrived at Plymouth and Jamestown in North America, they brought honeybees with them to pollinate their crops, which is true. The honeybee is a European and African species, not native to North America. But then he went on to say, if they hadn't, there would have been nothing to pollinate their crops. At which point I nearly drove off the road. Because what about the 4,000 species of native bees already buzzing happily around North America? I couldn't believe it. But that's not the worst of it. Given my interests, it will probably not surprise you to learn that I keep a copy of the reference book, Bees of the World, in my office. It's a fine hardbound edition written by two good, well-known entomologists. It's published by a good nonfiction press. And the cover features a lovely close-up color photograph of a fly. There's a fly on the cover of Bees of the World. It's outrageous. So here in the 21st century, I think it is by and large true that we find ourselves more familiar with the plight of bees from what we read about in the news than we are with the bees themselves, which means that the first place to start in any exploration of bees is with the most basic question of all, and that is, what is a bee? Now, I seem to be having technical difficulties, so we're going to kind of skip out on the rest of the slides. But I will leave this up here actually because I don't know how to even get it off of there. So you're looking at some wonderful stingless bees, but keep in mind that there is a great variety of bees that I would love to share with you if I could ever get the slide to advance. But I'm afraid we're stuck. Everything's frozen. Let's see. Can we move? No. I'm going to take one last second here to see if I can stop this thing. But it is totally frozen on me. I can't even get out of the screen share or control Zoom. So I'm afraid we're all going to be very familiar with these two stingless bees in the genus Trigona. And I will give you a side story on Trigona since we're going to stare at them for the next 20 minutes. And that is that this bee is very common in Central America. This species is common throughout the tropics. But if you are sitting in an outdoor restaurant in Central America, you will often see Trigona visiting your soda pop or visiting the hot sauce or anything that might have a bit of sugar in it, because they are ravenous for sweets to feed themselves, in addition to the pollen you see them carrying to take home for their offspring. So Trigona will be our mascot then as we continue here.
Tor, I can stop your share and maybe you can restart it then.
Oh, hey, let's try that. You know more about this than I do. Why don't you stop my share for a moment? Have you stopped it? Because I'm still frozen up on something here. Okay, good. All right, now let's see if we go back there. All right, escape from that. And if I come back to Zoom with all of you, can I share it again? Let's try it.
Yep.
Share this again and see if we can go over here. All right, are we back again?
Yep.
Okay. If you can hear me and you see a bumblebee about to crash into a purple lupin flower or something, I think we're on the same page. This is excellent.
Good.
Good. So what I would like to tell you about now is really the beginning of bees. It's this most basic bee question, and that is, what is a bee? Happily, there's an answer to that question that really I feel is simple, straightforward, memorable, and it sums up all the steps of bee evolution in a simple phrase, and that is to remember that a bee is a hippie wasp. A hippie wasp. Let me explain this. The first thing to remember is that wasps came first, and they had been around buzzing happily on this planet for millions of years before bees came along. Bees evolved from the wasps, and they still look quite a lot like them, which is why the two groups are so often confused. But if you find yourselves being harassed at a picnic like these unfortunate picnickers, and you see that your attackers are hovering around the roast beef or stealing bits of bologna from your sandwiches, well, don't blame bees, because in that situation, your attackers are certainly wasps, in that wasps are carnivorous, they are scavengers, they are constantly searching the landscape for other insects to hunt, or for spiders, or for bits of fleshy protein to take back to the nest to feed to their offspring. Bees set off on their own evolutionary pathway by giving up that carnivorous lifestyle and learning to fortify themselves and their offspring solely from the products of flowers. And once they made that dietary switch, their whole bodies and their habits began to evolve and adjust to that new lifestyle, including the evolution of long tube-like tongues for sipping nectar, the evolution of feathery branch-like feathery hairs that are specifically adapted, as you can see in this picture, for transporting grains of pollen from flowers back home to the nest. Now that switch set them apart and led them on the path to becoming bees. There is, of course, nuance to the story. There are bees that are parasitic upon other bees and don't bother collecting pollen at all. There are also wasps that are perfectly happy to land on a flower now and then and drink nectar. But if you want to remember the basics of bee evolution, you just remember that they are the long-haired, flower-loving vegetarians. They are the hippie wasps. Now, all of this evolutionary activity took place a long time ago. Bees have been with us for at least 120 million years, since the middle of the Cretaceous period, which was an age famously dominated by the dinosaurs. But if you can look past those lumbering beasts for a moment to the vegetation, you'll see something quite interesting. There are ferns, there are conifers, these things abound, but where are the flowers? You have to look pretty hard in this illustration to find a couple of shrubby looking things by old Triceratops that look as if they might be able to produce a flower. But the artist in this illustration had things exactly right, because at that time, flowers were a rarity. Still, bit players, flowering plants were a minority in a flora that was still dominated by conifers, by cycads, by ginkgos, and other early seed plants. It was, in fact, something of a mystery then for many scientists in the 19th century studying fossils to understand where on earth did all these flowering plants come from, right? Because back in the Cretaceous, it was all these conifers and early seed plants. You saw these in the fossils, and then boom, all of a sudden there were flowering plants. And they weren't just everywhere, they were suddenly diverse. This was something that Charles Darwin considered called an abominable mystery. I'm afraid my slides are frozen again, as they're often wont to do. It appears. Would you mind getting us out of the screen share once again, and then I think we'll abandon them for the moment. Let's see. Bear with us. Okay. If you can end my screen share, then we'll do a slight trick here and just look through these a different way. Oh, good. Excellent. Now, let me escape out of this. Okay. This isn't going to look quite as great, but I think you'll be able to see them a little bit better if we just do it this way. So now let me screen share once again. And we'll just do it this way. All right. Now you don't get a full image of Charles Darwin and his flower, but you get at least a little taste of Darwin. And we'll just click through the slides on the slide deck, and hopefully that won't jam up the same way the slideshow was slowing us down. So yeah, so I was just telling you about Darwin, of course. You can't give a natural history presentation without a few Darwin slides. So here we are. And this was something that Darwin called an abominable mystery, a famous comment that he made. It's often quoted, that the sudden rise of the flowering plants at the end of the Cretaceous was inexplicable. And he considered it one of the most serious scientific challenges to his own concept of evolution as a slow and steady incremental process. But what is less well known about that comment that he made is that it occurred in the same letter to a friend where he described his correspondence with another naturalist of the day, a Frenchman named Gaston de Saporta. And Saporta had written to Darwin and said he thought that, in fact, the flowering plants had evolved rapidly at the end of the Cretaceous because of their interactions with flower-visiting insects, particularly the bees. But of course, Darwin did not buy this. He didn't buy it. He preferred to think that flowering plants must have evolved slowly and incrementally someplace else and then dispersed rapidly to the locations where they became fossilized. Well, Darwin had a much bigger reputation at that time. And as you can see in this picture, he had a much bigger beard. And I think that really mattered in that era. People respected Darwin and his beard, and it was decades. It took until really the end of the 19th century before people, biologists, botanists, and everyone else began to realize that old Saporta had been right all along. That flowering plants did indeed evolve rapidly because of their interactions with insects, and particularly the bees. And the results of that interaction can be seen everywhere, from mountain meadows to your own gardens, to the nearest flower market, in the great diversity of flowers that we are all so familiar with. So that we now have a flora on this planet where 90% or more of the plant species are flowering plants, whereas before this interaction with bees, flowering plants were 5% or less. So really that interaction has led to great diversity. But what is less well known is how the diversity of flowering plants and the interaction with bees has led to a similar explosion of diversity within the bees themselves, which range from something familiar like this bumblebee to things that are utterly fantastic, like this wonderful iridescent sweat bee, a species, by the way, that you could see in your garden right there on Orcas Island. This is Agapostemon. To things that are downright strange, like this marvelous long-tongued specimen known only from Chile's Atacama Desert. And it's so new to science that it has only recently been described as a species. In terms of size, bees range from tiny things like this little golden bee, a cuckoo bee species that is glued to the side of a pin, so small that the taxonomist who was preserving this specimen couldn't find a pin small enough to go through the specimen, so was forced then to glue the bee to the side of the pin, all the way up to huge bees like this oil collecting bee from Puerto Rico. And of course, their colors were familiar with the black and the yellow stripes, but they can be sort of plain like the back of this leafcutter bee, but they can also be surprising, like this red bee. They can be sort of astounding, really, like this blue banded bee from Australia. They can even be iridescent and purple, like this orchid bee, a euglossine bee from French Guiana in South America. And while it is true that many bees are fuzzy, like this longhorned specimen, they can also be smooth and shiny, like this blood bee, or shimmering, like this, another species of orchid bee, this time from Central America. And while it's true that certain aspects of bees may be alarming, like this stinger you see here, it is also without doubt that there are many bees in the world that can only be described, in spite of their waving antennae and their faceted eyes and their stingers, they can only be described as cute. This wonderful little hairy-eyed bee from Argentina, another new species. So the co-evolution then between bees and flowering plants has led to great diversity on both sides of the equation. There are a full 20,000 species of bees buzzing around this planet, more than all the species of birds and mammals put together, and only a tiny fraction of those bees have ever been studied in detail. There are perhaps thousands that have yet to be discovered, and it's quite possible, sitting here in San Juan County, it's maybe even probable that we are within a few miles of a bee unknown to science, which is thrilling. And in fact, because it's the Orcas Island Garden Club, I will tell you that there is an Orcas Island cuckoo bee that was collected once, decades ago, and has never been seen again. It's out there somewhere, I have no doubt. A very small and unobtrusive bee, the Orcas Island cuckoo bee. I would love to see it someday. So keep your eyes peeled. Now, if I were giving this presentation 50 years ago, 100 years ago, I would stop now and take your questions. But in the 21st century, it really is impossible to talk about any natural wonder without confronting the challenges that they face. Because just as many bees are in decline, so too are many seeds and plants. And so too really are, in some cases, the relationships between flowering plants and the bees in the first place. I have just finished another book that is about the biology of climate change. And in doing so, I came across this particular local phenomenon. This is a wildflower in our flora, which may be familiar to you. This is the death camas, and this is the appropriately named death camas bee. It is the only bee in our fauna that has figured out how to detoxify the poisons found within the nectar and pollen of death camas. There's a beetle that can do it. There is a fly in the Northwest that can do it. But the only bee and the key pollinator then for the death camas is the death camas bee. But now that our springs are warming earlier and earlier, death camas in the San Juan Islands blooms 2 weeks earlier than it did as recently as 30 years ago. Yet the bee remains stuck on the old schedule. So the period of time for these species to overlap is narrowing. It is what biologists call a timing mismatch, something that is becoming more and more common with the rapid changes that we see around us due to climate change. And an example of where this very relationship between bees and flowers that we've been talking about is at risk. And of course, that's only one thing that challenges our wonderful common wonders. It's everything from climate change to habitat loss, the loss of crop diversity in terms of the reduction of the seeds out there. It is, in fact, a challenging time for any aspect of our ecosystem. which makes it all the more crucial for us then to really try to reconnect with nature and focus on doing that every day in any way that we can. We are stronger, I believe, when we are curious about nature, when we are approaching these problems from the standpoint of curiosity and fascination rather than despair and hopelessness. And so I would like to conclude then the presentation and move on to questions, but I'd like to conclude with a short passage that I will read to you from the book Buzz, which was the one about bees. And it's from the preface to the book. And I always feel that it is appropriate to end at the beginning, in a sense, because we really are still at the beginning of understanding even the biology of these things, and certainly at the beginning of doing what we can to help them. So this begins with another quotation, another of my favorites, not about seeds this time, but about bees. And it comes to us from Henry David Thoreau, who wrote, "There are certain pursuits which, if not wholly poetic and true, do at least suggest a nobler and finer relation to nature than the one we know. The keeping of bees, for instance, is like directing the sunbeams." Bees today certainly need our help, but just as importantly, they need our curiosity. Exploring the history and biology of these essential creatures can transform anyone into an enthusiast, and that is the purpose of this book. But I hope that you will do more than read it. I hope it makes you want to go straight outside on the next sunny day, find a bee on a flower, and settle down to watch. If you do, you might just find yourself daring to reach out and catch that bee, the same way that my young son has done since the age of 3, barehanded. Try this, and you too can feel the tickle of tiny feet and the whispery rustle of wings on your palm before you slowly part your fingers, hold the bee up, and set it free. With that, I want to conclude and thank you all for your patience as we struggled along through technological difficulties to get to the question and answer right here at the end of our presentation.
Thank you so much, Tor. I find myself thinking about all these parallels that we've managed to come together in these difficult times, and you've just posed some problems that are existential for us, I suppose, and that there are also, along with that, the hope that we can move through them. I've spent so many hours with your books, and so I just really value the time that we've had together and look forward to the next one. Thank you. I'm going to ask Mary and Holly. They'll pose more questions for you, and thank you for staying with us for those.
Oh, for sure. My pleasure.
Great. Okay, so first up, we have, could you address the importance of selecting heirloom seeds versus conventional seeds?
Yes, great question about seeds and the importance of heirloom seeds, the importance of seed sharing. There are a variety of answers to that question, and I'll try to be brief, but that's a problem I have, is being brief. I get kind of carried away. At any rate, one of the things that's important is sharing these seeds, continuing to plant them in our gardens so that they continue to respond and adapt to the changing climate that we have. If you consider many conventional seeds, or seeds even that are stored in seed banks, they are somewhat frozen in time. We tend to get to a variety and try to keep that variety exactly as it is because we have expectations of having the same thing, having a vegetable, for example, that looks the same on the store shelf, whether you're doing your shopping in San Juan County or in Florida. And so one of the important things about seed sharing, about heirloom varieties, is doing seed saving in a garden setting where we still allow the plants to adapt and to utilize the natural variability that they have to respond to change in their environment. So that is a part of the reason. Another part of the reason, I think, has to do, and this is something that I came to appreciate when I was working on the seed book, not so much as a scientist, it's more of a cultural phenomenon. And that is the importance in saving seed and sharing seed among people. It is foundational in our culture to do so. And I think one of the risks of relying wholly on commercially produced seed and the few varieties that are there, or relatively limited varieties, is that we deprive ourselves of this tradition of seed saving, of doing our own selections, finding the local varieties that do well in our yards, and of sharing those with our neighbors. This goes deep in our culture, whether you live in North America or whether you live in Africa, and places that I've lived abroad, Uganda, for example. Seeds were part of wedding rituals there in the very same way that they still are in our own wedding rituals. You don't see people throwing pork chops over the bride and the groom at a wedding. They throw seeds. They throw rice. You look abroad, you see wheat. The Romans used to throw wheat. A whole variety of seeds are shared in that way. In Africa, where I lived, it was millet and sorghum, and which is symbolic, but also very practical, in that what is going on there is the passage of accumulated agricultural knowledge from one generation to the next. Because when a bride and groom go home in Uganda with baskets of millet, those millet seeds, of course, can be planted and are intended to be planted. And they're not only symbolic, but very practical sharing of seeds from different families, because all families and communities in that part of the world have their own varieties that they've selected and that they use. And so you see this knowledge being passed forward and built upon. And that is still very important today. So one of the problems we face with limited seed source in conventional agriculture is not only a lack of adaptability and limits in terms of disease resistance or rapid change in the environment, but there's also a cultural impoverishment that goes along with that. And we can counter it by saving seeds and sharing them among friends and neighbors.
Perfect. And just a reminder to everybody that the library does have a seed bank where we invite the community to take a seed and bring a seed. And our librarian for that is Katie Wilkins. And we thank her and our director, Phil Heikkinen, for thinking of that and making it possible here on Orcas Island to share our seeds. Our next question is, do you have a picture of what the Orcas Island cuckoo bee looks like? And if it's not available today, you can definitely send it off to either Lena or Nita, and they can pass it on to the membership. But do you have an illustration of the Orcas Island cuckoo bee?
What an excellent question. There is no illustration of the Orcas Island cuckoo bee because it's known, as far as I can tell, from only one specimen. But it is very likely that it is a tiny bee, smaller than your pinky nail. And it's very likely, although I can't be sure, never having seen one, but if I were out looking for it, I would be looking for a tiny, tiny bee with a bright red abdomen. In the slides there was something called a blood bee that had a bright, shiny red abdomen. You'd be looking for that color, and you'd be looking for a very tiny insect, very recognizably a bee, if you can get close enough to see it, flying very low to the ground, back and forth over the ground with a red abdomen. There are many species in that genus around, but there's one, a specimen of which was collected years ago on Orcas, that seems to stand apart from the others and was named the Orcas Island cuckoo bee. So I've never seen it, and I've never seen the specimen. I've only seen the name in a list, a scientific list of bees and the date at which it was described. So there is a specimen someplace in a museum, but we don't have a picture of that bee. So it would take some sleuthing to get out there and rediscover it. I think it's a great project for the Orcas Island Garden Club. The behavior of the bee to look for is this habit of being very low to the ground, going back and forth and back and forth. And that habit developed because a cuckoo bee is a parasite upon other bees. And what it's doing is looking for the ground nests of other bees. That genus of bee particularly likes to parasitize mining bees, which nest in the ground. And so it's going back and forth using its antennae and so forth to sniff out, if you will, the distinctive odors of the particular species that it parasitizes. And what it will do if it finds a hole is wait till the mama bee is off collecting nectar and pollen, and then sneak into the hole and lay its own egg in that nest so that its larva will benefit from all the nectar and pollen that the mama mining bee has gathered. So these cuckoo bees are freeloaders. They're absolute freeloaders. They're sneaks, and they're out there in the spring and summertime doing this all day long. So keep your eyes peeled for any tiny little red bee, and it could very well be something unique to Orcas Island.
Cool, very cool. So is there such a thing as death camas honey?
If there were, now this is a really interesting question. Death camas honey. If there were, it would be deadly poisonous. And in fact, there are examples of honey in the world that are toxic. There are toxic honeys because the honey is directly influenced by whatever the bees are gathering. In the case of death camas, there is no death camas honey per se, because what the death camas bee gathers and leaves for its offspring is a ball of what they call bee bread, which is pollen wetted with nectar into a lump. And then she also nests in the ground, the death camas species, a species of mining bee, and she makes a ball of this bee bread and lays a single egg upon it, seals it off, and does the same thing. And we'll do 6 or 8 of these little chambers under the ground. And then her larvae, whom she never meets, she is not a social bee like the bumblebees or like the honeybees. She never meets her offspring. They hatch, they eat away at that pollen ball and grow and develop into adults. Usually they overwinter in the pupal form and then emerge the following spring, hopefully in time to, in the right time to see the death camas flowers and begin the whole cycle over again. So there is no honey then, in that honey is produced by highly social bees, particularly honeybees, of which there are about 11 species in the world, but also by bumblebees, of which there are several hundred species, and then also by those trigona and other stingless bees that we saw frozen upon our screen there for minutes on end during the presentation. The stingless bees are also highly social. And it is the highly social bees that produce honey because they need to feed one another over longer periods of time. And they need to feed a large nest of their sisters and feed the brothers now and then too when they show up. On a rainy day when they can't be out foraging, or for the case of honeybees, for example, over the course of the fall, winter, when there are no floral resources, they need to have food. So honey is produced to feed the adult bees, right, of these large colonies that last for a long time. But the vast majority, over 90% of the bee species out there, are solitary bees, like those little miners, that it's just one female bee with her own nest, minding her own business. She doesn't need to save food for sisters or hive workers. She has no help. She's doing it all herself. And so she does not produce honey in the same way.
Cool. Okay. So I would invite everybody that we are taking questions by chat. You have a button on your toolbar for your Zoom meeting that says chat, and you can chat with us at the library, and we will forward your questions on to Tor. So now we have Tor. Could you explain the best way to go about saving seeds so that they remain viable for the future generations?
Yes, you want to take your seeds to Masada, and they'll last for 2,000 years.
Uh-huh.
No, seriously, but that example does in a sense, highlight for us some of the ways that we can save seeds for longer periods of time. In that Masada is very dry, and these things were buried out of the reach of sunlight. And so keeping your seeds dry is important. Keeping them in a dark place is important. Some species of seed do well in a frozen setting. So at a place like the seed bank in Fort Collins, you have giant freezers where seeds are kept cold. That's another reason that one of the other big seed banks in the world is at Svalbard up in Norway, where it's cold all the time, even if the power goes out. So these are ways that seeds can be, that the dormancy of seeds can be extended. So any of those things would be important for saving your seeds. For most garden variety seeds, in our neck of the woods, dark, dry, you can even put some silica gel in the drawer with them to try to keep them dry. Those things will help extend the life of your seeds. And it raises an interesting question too for these seed banks, in that you want to make sure you're not saving a bunch of dead seeds, right? They only last so long. Maybe it's a couple of thousand years for a date pit, but it's still a finite amount of time, and far, far shorter for most species. So we tend to think of seed banks as a place where you just turn the key in the door and walk away, like a bank vault, but it's not that way at all. For active seed banks like the one in Fort Collins, they're constantly testing the germination rate, the viability of seeds, to make sure that the seeds are still good. And when they get below a certain threshold of viability, and as gardeners, you've all experienced this, sometimes you save seed for a few years and think, well, maybe I can get a row of this out there, and you throw it out and you only get a few plants, right? Because the seed was really starting to crater in terms of its viability. Well, seed banks are concerned about that because they want to have viable seed all the time. So once that viability rate dips below a certain threshold, then they must grow out those seeds to harvest fresh seed for the seed bank. And they do that through partnerships with growers all across the country. So whenever a species in the seed bank dips in viability, they send out seeds, a new harvest occurs in isolation so that they can get exactly what they want back again, the varieties they want for the seed bank, and replenish those stocks. So the same thing goes on in our own drawers full of garden seeds. When they get a little on the old side, we replenish our stock one way or the other.
To continue on that, before I move on, there's a concern with the seed bank in Norway because of climate change and the increase in temperature, and what they're going to do to try and save that stock for future use.
Yeah, twice now the abnormal temperatures up there have caused some flooding in the seed bank. So far, no damage to seeds, but still something that was quite shocking to the people who founded that project, in that it was chosen, the site was chosen as a place that seemed that would be safe, and perennially cold enough to preserve those seeds. So already it's one of those signs that climate change is progressing faster than we expected even a decade or two ago when that project was being planned.
So let's see, I have a comment about your book, Buzz, and that they really enjoyed your story and the humor that you included into it and personal experiences, and thanks you for a very fascinating work.
Thank you. I'm very glad that you enjoyed it.
The next one we have is the difference between mason bees and leafcutter bees.
Yes, mason bees and leafcutter bees. So we have a great variety, again, as I mentioned, a great variety of bees worldwide, but also locally. And you can see both of these in your own garden. Mason cutters and leaf cutters are in the same family. It's called Megachile. It's a big family of bees, and they have similar habits in that they are solitary, although they will nest in the same areas. So you'll see them, if you have a nesting block for mason bees, you'll see a bunch of bees there, but each female has her own hole, right? They don't share holes. They are solitary in their habits. And each one provisions its own nest, does all the work itself. The key difference, what you'll see for these bees, and you can watch this as they go in and out, you will see the mason bees carrying in their mandibles little balls of mud. They go out and they collect damp soil. Sometimes they'll moisten it if it needs to be moistened to get to the right consistency. And they use that mud as a mason would to shape the walls of the cell in which they're going to lay their egg. And then they seal it off and they make cell after cell, all encased beautifully in mud. And it's extremely smooth. I mean, you know, the surface of it, if you look under magnification, is just beautifully crafted. So those are mason bees. They use mud. The leaf cutter bees, and sometimes you'll see them using one of the holes in your mason block, particularly if you use a slightly larger tube for some of those tubes, you'll get some mason bee or some leaf cutters too, and watch them go in and out, and you will see them carrying neatly clipped little pieces of leaf. And you can see the evidence of it out in your garden. They love the leaves of lilac bushes, for example. If you see lilac bushes with scalloped edges that have been cut very neatly, like with a pair of scissors, that would be from mason bees. And they use then the leaves to form a leaf casing around the cell. Some use flower petals. There are a whole variety of things that leaf cutters will use. So they're cousins, if you will, very similar in habit, but they differ in the material they use to construct the nest.
Okay. We have a question. If you could name again the contact technician you had at the Fort Collins Seed Bank.
Yes, her name is Dr. Chris Walters. She's the director of the seed bank there, and she's brilliant, a brilliant scientist and a warm and wonderful person. So very much enjoyed my time with her. And she, you know, the facility there is fascinating and quite fantastic. It's not flashy and showy the way Svalbard is, and serves in some ways a slightly different purpose. It's a very active seed bank. Svalbard, the one you see in National Geographic and so forth up in Norway, is a great facility, but it's really sort of a backup for the active seed banks like the one in Fort Collins and Kew Gardens, and up to 1,000 now, or maybe more than 1,000 spread around the world. Active seed banks are the ones where they're keeping their seed viable, replanting and doing all that sort of thing. Svalbard is sort of like a reference library. Fort Collins will send copies of their seeds up there for long-term safekeeping in case something happened at Fort Collins, right? One of the things they worry about when they sit down and write the long-range plan for a place like Fort Collins is what happens in an earthquake, what happens, if there's a fire, and they try to design for those eventualities. So at Fort Collins, one of the worries is Horseshoe Lake, which is the water source for the city that is upstream in the same valley behind a big earthen dam. And if that dam were to burst, Fort Collins would flood. So the seed bank itself, the inner core of the seed bank, is in a separate, almost, if you will, a floating building within a building. So it's designed so that if that lake were ever to flood the city, the seeds within that seed bank would pop up like a cork. That whole central part of the building is protected from a flooding event. So again, the seed bank is fascinating, and you find all of these ways that people have tried to plan ahead for any eventuality, because those eventualities, they come to pass. The seed bank in Iraq, for example, was destroyed during the Iraq War. Of course, they moved those seeds, many of which were precious, because this is one of the cradles of agriculture. They evacuated a lot of them at great personal risk to the seed bank in Syria, which then was destroyed. And so they did eventually get most of the seeds out of Syria as well. So they were saved in the end, but most of them, but still great losses do occur with these seed banks.
So once we're done with COVID down the road, is the Fort Collins Seed Bank open to the public?
It's not open to the public. I think they do occasionally do tours. So it would be something you'd want to get in touch with them about and see if there's a way to sign up to see it. They're very gracious to visitors, but it's not an open facility regularly, but I would not be at all surprised if they didn't have, an annual open house or something like that where they show people around.
Okay. All right. Well, unless someone else is open to chat, I think that was the end of our questions for you, Tor. And I'll turn this back over to Lena and Nita.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Tor. Do you have any last minute things you'd like to share with us, Tor, before we end?
No, other than it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for the great questions, and I wish you all a great day.
Thank you. We're looking forward to your new book. Thank you so much for taking time to spend with us today.
My pleasure.